Welcome back to our third and final part of our overview of the German home front during World War One. We've been looking at how the conditions were certainly worsening in Germany as we go through 1915 and 1916. Yet the German government was able to maintain control and certainly at least put effort into the industries that were directly supporting the war front, the battlefront. As we get into 1916, 1917, however, things get even worse for the German home front. So that winter between 1916 and 1917 is referred to as the turnip winter. It was a particularly harsh one in Germany. You've got to have a think. The failure of the potato crop failed in that year, so a really staple part of the diet has disappeared. And as we go into winter time with a shortage of coal, we've got minimal heating and cooking facilities available particularly to our city urban dwellers. And the health of these people really did start to decline. The staple diet by this stage was turnips and more turnips and what is called flocken or potato peelings. And this becomes a really important part of the diet. Also, the KRA scientists, that is the Department of Raw Materials. Remember, our chemical engineers were brilliant in Germany during World War One, and they are developing what are called ersatz foods. Let me show you so we're on the German home front, and I need to show you some of these words. So we've got flocken, which is the potato peelings, and now we're developing these ersatz foods, okay, substitute foods, ersatz being this word that's used. So things like meat, which there's a shortage of, becomes made from vegetable flour, barley, and mushrooms. And a very common one is finely ground sawdust is used as a substitute for flour. And as the shortage of wheat gets more problematic, then the higher the rate of sawdust that you will find in your bread. Not surprisingly, we see an increase in nutrition-related diseases occurring. And also because of the living conditions with poor heating, we also get outbreaks of tuberculosis, anemia, and pneumonia. By 1917, the official rations given to German civilians only provided half the average daily calorie requirement. So if you were living on rations alone, you were not. You were only getting half of what you actually needed to support yourself. This was great if you were richer. You might be able to afford the black market. In the country environment, as we've discussed, you might be able to supplement your rations with something that you've grown or caught yourself. But for the urban working poor, this was a very disastrous situation. There are estimates as high as saying that 700,000 Germans died on the home front from malnutrition-related diseases during the war. We can see here, I know it's a very fuzzy picture, but the German government had a drive to actually go through the city streets and collect the flocken, the potato peelings. So these housewives have, very much collected the potato peelings and are giving them to the government so that they can turn them into some new yummy kind of ersatz food. And this one from a little bit earlier in the war, you can see that very spiffily dressed, but they've got ersatz products on sale. So things like coffee made from chicory, which is a plant and really doesn't taste all that nice. So different ways of trying to maintain a food supply, but it's all substitute and it really does not taste as nice and the nutritional value is not as high either. We've got a couple of propaganda posters here from later in the war as times are really getting quite desperate. This one here from 1918, coal is bread. So equating the problems, so making sure you don't waste your coal on yourself because that coal will actually give you the wheat that you need to grow to eat your bread. And this one on the right, farmers, do your duty. The cities are starving. And so it's really reflecting what's happening, particularly in the cities in Germany as we get towards the end of the war. At the same time, however, there's an attempt to try to keep things going as smoothly as possible. And these pictures are from 1917, and this massive statue of Hindenburg celebrating his 70th birthday, and crowds coming out in Berlin to kind of celebrate his birthday, try to have some feeling of normality. But at the same time, people were starting to get very hungry and very discontented. So as time goes on, we really start to see the workers left behind in Germany become more discontent. And from 1916 onwards, we do start to see strikes. But you've got to think, prices have risen by 400%, but at the same time, working conditions have got worse. People are working much longer hours. They're not being paid anymore. And food shortages, of course, have worsened as well, as we know. From 1917 onwards, we do start to see political protests in the streets and a growing anti-war sentiment, including some peace rallies. This picture here is from January 1918. There was a general strike in that month. It started with 100,000 workers out on the streets in Berlin demanding an end to the war on all fronts. And this strike went on for a couple of days until there were 400,000 strikers on the streets in Berlin, and other cities across Germany as well joined in the general strike. And there were some 4 million people across Germany out on the streets protesting. Now, the government can't let that go on. So there was a massive crackdown at the end of January 1918. They're concerned that Germany will go the way of Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution, which had happened in November 1917. And certainly there are very much socialists are behind pushing for these rallies, but it's the discontent of the people that is, continuing to drive it. But at the end of that 1918, there's a massive crackdown, mass arrests. 150 were put in prison, but another 50,000 men were forcibly drafted and sent off to the front, either the Eastern Front or mostly to the Western Front by that stage, of course. And so the government does need to stay in control, and the military dictatorship that was being put in place, controlled by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, was effective and was able to keep things slightly under control as 1918 went on. The morale is, however, affected by also direct attacks on German civilians, especially as 1918 goes on and the Western Front comes closer back to the German border. Then a number of German cities come into bombing range. And during 1918, about 740 civilians are killed and another 1,900 wounded by these direct attacks on German soil from the British and French bombers. Early in 1918, there is a bit of a lift in the mood in Germany as we see the Ludendorff offensives, the spring offensives. To begin with, they are quite successful. And it seems like Germany will actually achieve that victory that they've been promising to the people for so long. But by August 1918, it becomes very clear that the German position of strength has now been eroded, and the Allies quickly make ground on their counter-offensives. And it's hard for us to understand, but the German civilian population have been fed propaganda constantly, and very highly censored reports of what was happening on the battlefields. And at all times, even though things were getting bad on the home front, they were constantly being fed news that they were holding their ground and they were in sight of a victory at any time. And so as we move through 1918 and we are seeing German defeat after German defeat, this actually rocks the German civilian population. It really does shock them. And we start to see the development towards the end of 1918 of a revolutionary type atmosphere. And this is not only the civilians on the home front that are discontent, but soldiers actually start to leave the front line, wander back into the cities. We've also got those who've been sent home injured. And we can see this photo from the 9th of November 1918. This is before the armistice, where we've got armed revolutionaries out on the streets of Berlin. The other thing is that these soldiers' councils start to develop. This is a very socialist idea that soldiers can organise themselves, and they were much more effective than the government at this time at actually distributing goods, flour and tea to the civilian population and winning over their support. In September 1918, as we will learn, that's the point at which the German army effectively tell the German government that they need to seek a peace, or else Germany will, really suffer the consequences from the Allied counter-offensive that is very quickly pushing towards German territory. At this time, the Reichstag was given a lot more power. So the parliament, remember, very limited powers at the beginning of the war. But there seems a need to create a constitutional democracy. And as we will learn, there's a lot of pressure from the Americans, the British and the French to actually change the system of German government before they will enter into peace negotiations. So the Kaiser eventually is forced to abdicate. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are forced to resign, and we move into, in November 1918 in Germany, a Republican socialist government. And that guy I introduced you to, Ebert, actually becomes the new leader. And we can see here, November 1918 in Berlin, anti-war rallies, certainly encouraged by socialists like Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. These guys were very much the more radical socialists. And while it's the more conservative socialists that seize control of the government, the radical socialists are pushing for more. Remember that the Russian Revolution has taken place, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and the more radical socialists in Germany are pushing for the same kind of problems, the same kind of revolutionary attitudes to shift the government even further in Germany. As a sign of just how difficult things were, I talk here about Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht leading rallies in November 1918, but by February 1919 they had been shot dead. They were such a threat to stability in Germany that their lives were ended. You can see here as another example, this is a poster from 1919 in Germany, an attempt to restore calm and fight against anarchy and the spread of socialism. And the poster actually does say, Bolshevism will drown the world in blood. This is the threat that is felt about the spread of Bolshevism, about radical socialist ideals around the world after the Russian Revolution. And this will actually help us to understand not only some of the things that are happening in Europe at the end of World War I, but also what's happening in Russia and the intervention in the Russian Civil War that takes place at the end of World War I. So what we can see there in Germany is that it was much more harshly impacted and affected than the British home front. Things started to get bad and impacted on the social conditions very quickly. The government had a reasonable control of the economic situation from fairly early on, but even then, as the war continued in 1916, again we saw the German government, especially when Hindenburg and Ludendorff take control, to have to take a much tighter control of the economic situation, the labour situation in Germany. And unlike what happens in Britain, in 1918 we see a real outbreak of revolutionary attitudes, anti-war feelings really bubble out on the German home front during 1918 and actually contribute to the need for Germany to end the war, to get out of the war and sign some kind of treaty once the war does end. This finishes up our overview of the German home front during World War I.